On March 23, 2012, astronauts aboard the International Space Station were woken up in the middle of the night by mission control. Something was heading straight for them. They had 11 minutes. No one knew how big it was. That's the reality of living in low Earth orbit. A graveyard of human-made debris traveling at 5 miles per second in every direction. And the ISS sits right in the middle of it. NASA has tracked more than 500,000 objects orbiting Earth, ranging from defunct satellites to fragments smaller than a marble. Most of the big stuff can be tracked. It's the stuff too small to see but large enough to kill that keeps engineers up at night. Space junk is largely our own doing. Decades of launches, collisions and explosions have littered the orbital environment with debris. A half-inch fleck of paint traveling at orbital velocity carries the same kinetic energy as a motorcycle hitting a wall at 60 miles per hour. Scale that up to a bolt, a panel, a spent rocket stage, and you begin to understand why debris management is one of the most serious ongoing challenges of the entire ISS program. Space Command monitors the orbital environment around the clock, cataloging objects and calculating trajectories. When something appears to be on a path that could intersect with the ISS, Mission Control is notified. Engineers then assess the risk using a 3-tier system: a green zone, a yellow zone, and a red zone. Objects in the red zone have at least a 1 in 10,000 chance of striking the station. That sounds small. In space, it's unacceptably dangerous. When a red zone threat is identified with enough advance warning, the ISS can maneuver. Small thrusters fire, nudging the station into a slightly different orbit, just enough to move it out of the debris object's path. It's a delicate operation. The ISS weighs 460 tons. Moving it requires careful calculation of thrust, timing, and fuel expenditure. And fuel is not free. Propellant costs $110,000 per pound to get into orbit, and every maneuver burns through a finite supply that has to be replenished from Earth. But sometimes there isn't enough warning. Sometimes the debris is identified too late to maneuver safely. And that's exactly what happened on March 23, 2012. The crew was asleep when Mission Control made the call. A fragment of space debris, origin unknown, size unknown, was on a trajectory that would bring it within dangerous proximity of the station. Time to closest approach: 11 minutes. There was no time to maneuver. There was barely time to prepare. The crew did what they were trained to do. They moved fast, and they moved methodically. Every single hatch on the station had to be closed, a process that takes roughly 45 minutes under normal circumstances. They didn't have 45 minutes. They worked through it anyway, sealing off each module so that if one section was breached, the rest of the station might survive. The hatches are designed to withstand a sudden loss of pressure, a critical feature that could mean the difference between a survivable emergency and a catastrophic one. With 6 minutes to closest approach, the situation was still unresolved. With 3 minutes remaining, the crew made the decision to evacuate to the Soyuz spacecraft, the Russian capsules permanently docked to the station that serve as the ISS's lifeboats. They floated in, began initial preparations for undocking, and waited. 1 minute to closest approach, and then they just sat there, waiting, hoping. It missed. A near miss, but a miss. The crew returned to the station, reopened the hatches, and went back to work. But the incident underscored something that every engineer and astronaut connected to the ISS understands deeply. The station cannot rely on luck. It needs systems, it needs redundancy, it needs the ability to protect itself and its crew from threats that move faster than the human eye can track. The Whipple shield handles the small stuff, the micrometeorites and paint flecks that bombard the station constantly. The maneuvering thrusters handle the large tracked objects when there's enough warning, but the thrusters come with a cost that goes beyond propellant. Every time the ISS fires its thrusters to dodge debris or adjust its orbit, it's drawing down a resource that has to be shipped from Earth at enormous expense. For the ISS to be a truly self-sufficient outpost, a model for future deep space habitats, it needs a way to manage its orientation and movement without burning fuel. And it has one. Hidden near the very core of the station, it's one of the most ingenious engineering solutions on the entire ISS, and most people have never heard of it. They're called Control Moment Gyroscopes, or CMGs. There are 4 of them, each housed in a casing roughly the size of a small cupboard, mounted on a truss at the center of the station. Inside each one is a flywheel spinning at 6,600 revolutions per minute. And by changing the speed of those flywheels, or tilting the plane in which they spin, the CMGs transfer angular momentum directly to the ISS, rotating the entire station without firing a single thruster. Think about what that means. A structure the size of a football field, weighing 460 tons, being steered through space by 4 spinning wheels, using no propellant whatsoever. The physics behind it is the same principle you'd experience if you were sitting in a spinning chair holding a gyroscope. Slow the gyroscope down, and the chair starts to spin. The angular momentum has to go somewhere, and the CMGs direct it into the station itself. The ISS orbits Earth every 90 minutes. To keep the cupola observation module pointed toward Earth, to keep the solar panels optimally oriented, to maintain the station's attitude relative to its direction of travel, all of that requires constant, precise adjustment. Without the CMGs, every one of those adjustments would require a thruster burn. With them, the station can be reoriented continuously, silently, and for free, as long as there's electricity to keep the flywheels spinning. And electricity is something the ISS has in abundance, thanks to one of its most visually striking features, its solar arrays. The solar panels of the ISS are enormous. Each array spans roughly half an acre. Together, they cover an area larger than the station's pressurized modules combined. They generate up to 120 kilowatts of power, enough to supply electricity to 40 average American homes, and they do it entirely from sunlight, at no ongoing cost. Getting those panels into space required its own engineering breakthrough. Panels that large couldn't be launched in their deployed configuration. They'd never fit inside a rocket fairing. So NASA engineers designed them to fold, accordion style, into compact packages that could be carried in the shuttle's cargo bay and then unfurled once in orbit. Deploying a half-acre solar array in the vacuum of space, with no gravity to help and no room for error, is the kind of task that sounds impossible until someone figures out how to do it. Once deployed, the panels don't just sit there, they track the sun. As the ISS moves through its orbit, the panels rotate on motorized gimbals to stay pointed directly at the sun, maximizing power generation at every moment. The system has been running for over 177,000 hours, and counting. That power runs everything: the life support systems, the communications equipment, the science experiments, the lighting, the computers, the water recycling systems, and, critically, the thermal control systems, because temperature management on the ISS is a matter of life and death. In sunlight, the exterior of the station can reach 250 degrees Fahrenheit. In shadow, it can plunge to negative 250 degrees. That's a 500-degree swing, sometimes within minutes, as the station passes in and out of Earth's shadow 16 times a day. The interior has to stay within a narrow range that humans can survive, and maintaining that range requires a cooling system unlike anything used on Earth. Convection doesn't work in microgravity. Conduction is insufficient for the heat loads involved. Standard air conditioning is useless. The ISS uses a 2-loop liquid cooling system, water on the inside, ammonia on the outside. Internal water loops collect heat from electronics and crew activity, then pass it through heat exchangers where ammonia takes over. The ammonia, which remains liquid down to -107 degrees Fahrenheit, carries that heat out to large external radiators, where it's dissipated into the cold of space. It works. It works remarkably well. But ammonia is extraordinarily toxic. Contact with it is lethal. And in May 2013, it started leaking. Coming up in the next episode, we'll go outside the station, in spacesuits, in the void, to find out what it takes to fix a life-threatening ammonia leak while floating 250 miles above the Earth. And we'll look at the water recycling system that turns something you'd never want to think about drinking into water cleaner than anything that comes out of a tap. If this series is giving you a new appreciation for what it takes to live in space, subscribe now. We're just getting started, and the next episode gets even more intense.